I've been working with Ruby and Rails for about 9 years now. I've been to countless conferences, but this is my first time actually talking and giving something back, so I'm pretty stoked to be here. And it's kind of interesting because about 9 some years ago, when I first started learning Ruby and Rails, this company 37 Signals had just released this product, Highrise, that was a simple CRM. You may know them as the people who do Basecamp, Ruby on Rails, Campfire, a bunch of other stuff. And when I was first learning, the Rails 2 was like hot off the press at the time. And whenever I was stumbling, I was just thinking back to this thing that DHH was always talking about and thinking how interesting and amazing their code probably has to be. And fast forward a little bit, and in 2014, 37 Signals announced that they were going to be rebranding to Basecamp, and all their efforts would be put on Basecamp, the product. A few months later, Highrise spun out into a separate company, and a weird sequence of events occurred, and I'm working with the small team of 7 people as the CTO. So today I'm going to be talking about how this tiny little team took this really large and unfamiliar code base and iterated on it and breathed life back into this 10-year-old code base. Yeah, I was originally going to talk about the technical implementation of how we were going to be doing, how we're going to be rebuilding Highrise, but while I was writing this last week, it was actually a lot more interesting about why we were doing the things that we were doing instead of how. So instead of putting another talk about microservices out into the ether, there's another one today that looks really great. I'm going to talk about the reasoning behind how we ended up in this situation. And I think it'll resonate with anyone who's fallen backwards into a code base and we're expected to actually make changes to it. So our story starts with one very important concept. That's momentum. The byproduct of small things done consistently over a period of time. That is not a sanctioned definition of momentum, but it damn well should be, because for everything that we do, this is the most important thing that we should be focusing on. This is what keeps us focused, excited. It's what keeps winning teams winning and losing teams losing. And it's all really quite simple. We do a small thing, we do it really well, and then we do another small thing, and we do it really well, and then another small thing. And over time, those things build up to an unstoppable force, like this guy. So the Kool-Aid Man has momentum. That's what, I guess, lets a glass mascot bust through a wall without breaking. When we first took over Highrise, it did not have momentum, and it's painfully clear when that happens. So back then, when the announcement was made, a lot of people thought that when Basecamp was spinning off Highrise, that it was going to be shut down, which unfortunately makes a lot of sense. I mean, you probably use Sunrise or Mailbox or some other apps that were popular but got shut down as soon as the business interests changed. So that's something that we had to contend with. And to make things a little bit worse, this is our commits over time. And commits don't necessarily correlate to product velocity, but you can clearly see when the product was under active development and when it was not. And that's a really long tail towards the end. So a product that just got spun off from its parent company and hasn't been changed in a while, but there's a very large customer base, they start to look elsewhere. Competition is stiff, so we need to fix that. So how exactly do we get momentum back in a large app that we're kind of unfamiliar with how it all works? That's a long question that I'll get to, but before that, let's take a look at what we're dealing with. This is an old application. It was built by the people who built Ruby and Ruby on Rails, so it's as clean and as structured of a code base as you could possibly imagine, but it's a little bit old, and it's amassed a long history. Over 23,000 commits from 43 people. There's 120,000 lines of Ruby, ERB, CSS, and JavaScript. And it's operating at a pretty good scale, over 100 million contacts stored. And as a CRM, that's like one of our primary data objects, as well as email. We've got 275 million or so email notes and comments. So actually, that's 800 gigs in MySQL and 32 terabytes of user data. So it's a lot of code to understand and a lot of data to manage. The app is also, it's complex and has a large surface area. We manage several of our own client applications like the web app, mobile web, iOS, and an upcoming Android app. We have a REST API that has tons of third-party integrations that's very active all the time, and some other interfaces that are kind of invisible but have a whole depth to them, like email, importing and exporting. There's people in the world who still use different versions of, say, Excel 2003 in Germany that can't import, so we have to address those types of issues. So customers are all over the world, and they do everything from sophisticated business workflows on top of it to hacking together stuff in a way that we've never dreamt of that would be considered maybe a bug, but they run their business on it. So the code base reflects the necessary complexity to allow all that. But our biggest challenge by far is compatibility. So as I said, the app is a little bit old, and it relies on older frameworks and runtimes. So it kind of limits the technology that we can bring in nowadays. The version of Rails that we're running is 3 major releases behind current. And aside from security fixes and upgrades, it hasn't really had any meaningful changes to the stack in a long time. So things right now, if you go boot up a new Rails app and you just take them for granted, it's just there like Air, Sass, or jQuery, that was actually way ahead of where we were at. Sprockets that was talked about earlier, that's what our asset pipeline uses. The asset pipeline was developed in parallel to the way that our app is built. So things then further down the road, like Rails engines or Action Cable that people are using to make some cool stuff these days, that's just a pipe dream. So learning a code base like this it's pretty intense, and it takes a really long time to become even remotely comfortable working in it. So the Basecamp folks, they're very helpful. Every time we have any issues, they help us and give us backstory or some guidance if we've needed it. And their ops team still manages all our bare metal servers along with Basecamp stuff. But all the people who worked on Highrise at Basecamp no one transitioned with the product. So pretty much from day one, here it is, figure out where we want to take the product, and just go ahead and do it. So that's pretty daunting. So with all that in mind, how exactly do we build some momentum in an environment like this? We need to come to grips with a business, product, and code base as fast as we possibly can and start showing momentum. So the way that we did that is kind of a long story. I've broken it down into what I'm calling the 3 stages of code base enlightenment. I just made this up, but it generally maps fairly well to once you first get involved in a new code base. The way that you approach things changes as you become more comfortable. So stage 1, this is the stage of confusion. We started here in August 2014. We know high level what this product does, but we don't necessarily know why it works the way that it does or how many of the things are done inside. There's more unknowns than there are knowns. And the chances of doing anything without breaking something else approaches 0 as more than one line of code is changed. So that's where we started. The first and the most important thing once we got to this stage is to establish a regular release train or just a release cadence. So every month we sent out a newsletter that was chock full of updates and new feature announcements and whatnot. And this was actually really big for customers who haven't heard from the company in years to suddenly start receiving monthly newsletters that had a bunch of new features addressed. That got their attention really fast. So it was really important for us to start establishing this cadence. If a feature wasn't ready for the announcement, the train went ahead anyway. So that made our job really clear. How can we figure out what we can do given the resources available to make sure that when that train goes out, we have as much as we possibly can. So if a big feature, say, slips, that just means we prioritize out and work on a few smaller things. A product with as much history as Highrise requires some pretty careful consideration before you go in and rip up the carpet and whatnot. Most of the people have used Highrise in the past, but many of our customers have years more experience than we did with the product. So even though we want to get in there and change stuff, we would be disrupting people's workflow. So it was really important at the beginning to kind of step back and just let customers talk to us and tell us what was broken, what was important, and feel their pain, and from there start to figure out what we can do. There's just listening to them a whole bunch of things that are very, very small, like just bug fixes and streamlining some of their processes that to them seems like a whole new product. For us, it's like an hour fix. So we focused a lot on that in the early days. The best products also tend to have makers, the makers of the product who use the product. So it was really important to us to get in as fast as possible and use our own product to get to know the same pain that our customers are feeling. So to do that, we switched an active user or active customer support from Desk to Highrise, and we're powering our recruiting workflow and a few other things through it as well. So us getting in there, you just realize, oh, like adding a tag to a contact takes 12 clicks. We could just do that in one. So we make the change, and then customers actually would respond before we even announcing it, saying this is really cool. The bar was very low when we took over, so little things made a big difference. Larger projects tend to touch more of the code base, so they take longer to implement and they have more risk. So it was really important when focusing on momentum, just keep things small, keep things manageable. So fixing a bug or changing copy, streamlining a workflow, anything that can be done in a few days. Because it was far better to have a handful of small features go out than it was to aim for something bigger, only to have it slip, and then we're kind of empty-handed for a few weeks. And then that goes to the next point, which is if we have limited resources and we're trying to focus on things that customers care about, we generally didn't take time in the early days to work on anything that was internal to us. We were able to get in and make some pretty good changes to the code base as it was. So spending a week optimizing our deployment was just not going to impact our users, so we didn't focus on that. So resources were precious at that time. So after 6 months frantically learning the code base, we finally reached stage 2, which is competency. And this is all kind of wishy-washy here. I don't know if you ever really become competent, but you start to think that you are. So at this point, we're pretty aware of how it functions, kind of still unknown about why it functions, but we know where to look if we encounter any kind of unknowns. And I think that's really the big thing. That's the difference between feeling completely lost and being able to, like, go dig for yourself. We also had the bandwidth and confidence to take on some larger projects that pushed the system as hard as we possibly could before it came crumbling down. So the first of that, or well, one of the early projects was upgrading the runtime and the frameworks just piece by piece. I've done this many times, and I mean, how hard could this be? You just go through a checklist and all that. So I thought I could get this done in a few days. It went something like this. You've probably seen that before. So this is the Dunning-Kruger effect in action. The less that we knew about the code base, the easier that we thought big changes actually would be like an upgrade. But once we found out that something didn't work and we looked into it, we uncovered this whole rabbit hole of changes that needed to be, like big systems that would have to be refactored or completely rewritten before we could even be compatible with the thing that would actually be compatible with the thing that would be a version of Rails that we were moving to. So at that point, if we're going to be spending a year iterating to get upgraded to a newer version of Rails, newer version of Ruby, you just start asking yourself, what's the point of all this? There's a diminishing return spending a ton of time on this. And if you look at Airbnb or GitHub, they have a handful of people who have worked for years to do these upgrades from the very old versions to a little bit more modern. I think many of them are still stuck on Rails 3. So upgrading the internals is a massive expenditure that we weren't really excited to do. So we decided to stick with older versions, and knowing that we were going to be forced to rewrite some stuff in the back of our head, it kind of bought us a little bit of we were okay letting things not be perfect on our end. And that comes to the next point, which is debt. So if you look in a 10-year-old code base, you'll find all sorts of things everywhere you look that should be improved or that you would do different than if you were to do it today. But I look at code that I wrote 10 weeks ago, and I find stuff that I would do different now or that could be better. So no matter how much you plan, you take this barbecue, it always ends up pretty much like a piece of garbage. So that's just a fact of building stuff and getting better every day. So you just have to embrace that it's going to always be garbage, and that's just because your expectations rise as the product and as the project does. So we had to embrace that, and that was actually somewhat liberating because if we knew that debt was all around us and we were okay with that, then we could start to leverage debt to move faster in the short term. And again, knowing that there's going to be some legit rewrites down the road. So at this point, we started also taking on larger projects. We were not as concerned with momentum is always important, but we weren't as concerned with shipping a whole bunch of stuff because people had started to expect that we were going to be coming out with new stuff. So we bought a little bit of the ability to pay for larger projects with some of our previous momentum. 2015, we shipped some large stuff like an iOS app, a real-time group inbox, and like a bulk email tool. Each of those took at least one person 1 month. So in order to ensure that momentum was still strong elsewhere, we had to make sure that the rest of the team was still focusing on small stuff so that it looked like more of tick-tock cycle. One large project while a bunch of small stuff shipped, the large feature ships, and then a bunch of small stuff after that. So the 80-20 rule is very important with this. To keep things from spiraling out of control, we didn't want to bring in new technology, just like figure out what we have, what are the boundaries, and stick within it. And even though there's maybe better ways to do stuff, like the real-time group inbox, we probably could have used WebSockets and then maybe React on the front end, but then we'd need a new build system, and Webpack is a thing, and then NPM yanks out left pad, so then we'd have to like get us left pad as a service and all that stuff. So there's probably pretty cool stuff that we could have done had we gone down that path. But we just did polling, and it took us like 20 minutes, and we shipped the feature, and our customers were blown away that we had real time in the app, and that's just good enough for right now. Done is better than perfect. So after kind of toiling away for about a year in this stage, early 2016, we finally hit a point of proficiency, and this is one that I use very leniently because I don't know if we ever really, again, understand a code base. You're just getting beaten around by it. And, but once you get to this point, at least when you do get pushed back by the code base, you have enough confidence and enough insight to be able to push back and say, nope, this is a legit constraint. We're just going to break through it over here. So this was the point that we finally started to say, we're going to have to pay some of this debt back. We're going to have to rewrite. But to understand what we needed to do, the specific constraints that we had, this is a giant code base, and everything that we add to it needs to adhere to the same compatibility as everything that's already in it, which again is like 7 years old. And anything that we add has to be interwoven with the existing stuff. So if we were to say build a new contact system, it couldn't coexist with the old one if everything was all intermingled and spaghetti together. So this hasn't really been that big of a problem when we focused on smaller features. Like here, the bottom left, the higher the value, the more time it takes. And the line purposefully doesn't hit the top because it's not possible to get the high value in our current world here. This wasn't an issue when we worked on smaller projects because they fit those constraints. But if we stick to smaller projects in the left corner, lower time means lower value. If we want to walk up the value chain, then we're going to have to start doing some big stuff. The path that we've decided to go down was reluctantly microservices. And I say reluctantly just because it's kind of a hot thing right now, and you could bump on people down the street in Chicago here who will try to sell you on microservices. And it's a lot of overhead for something so small like this. It would be maybe easier to pull the toast out, but you don't get engineering street cred for just taking the toast out. So microservices are great if you need them, but in our case, we're not building a constellation. We don't have thousands of developers that we're trying to unlock the maximum potential. We just had some really old code that wasn't compatible, so let's just build that outside the monolith. And I guess we could justify this too. If you take monolith, there's always going to be web processes and worker processes in cron. So what if we just had like a contact service that ran next to it and a email service or something? And that's blurring the lines a little bit, but if we're writing the services to be not generic across other teams, we're building it specifically for our own product. They're in the same monolithic repository. The deployments look all similar. It's actually not been too bad, but your mileage may vary. It is kind of a pain in the ass. And Docker may not be a thing, I guess, in a few months. So like, no one really knows what's going to happen with the deployment strategy there. So we're only considering them because we don't have another option. Our decision-making process looks a lot like this, that in the cases of something, if something doesn't have compatibility issues with the monolith, build it in the monolith. And then that's a done story, and we can move on. If it doesn't fit within the monolith, it's a lot better to then take on the burden of microservices than it is to not ship something. We've done it a few times for some pretty critical systems, like a delivery backend to support our bulk email tool. We've been really happy with the results. And the next step is going to be replacing an actual core piece of functionality, something that serves hundreds of requests per request to actually fulfill for the main app. So eventually our hope is that as the code footprint in the main application is reduced from extracting services, then this thing gets to be a lot smaller, a lot leaner, that we can maybe upgrade and consider bringing things back in or not. We're open to it, though. So in the 2 years since we took over, we've shipped a lot of code. This is what the other end of that chart, where the team took over right at the end of 2014. We've deployed over 1,200 times or so since we've been keeping track in the last 18 months. And focusing on momentum really paid off. The customer base that previously wasn't sure if we'd be around much longer is excited and engaged, and they're putting more of their businesses on Highrise and depending on us more for critical things and referring more customers. So the cycle has been pretty virtuous. And we couldn't have done it without focusing relentlessly on momentum and resourcefulness. So just focusing on doing something well and doing it all the time and making the most of what we had. And as the team grows and the product evolves, this is going to be a core tenet of our culture for a long time to come. That is all I have. I've got a little bit of time. Any questions or anything? Comments?